Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Elected members, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, to formally welcome you this evening, may I introduce the Right Honourable, the Lord Provost of the City of Glasgow, Councillor Eva Bollander.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my immense pleasure to welcome you to the City Chambers for the Jimmy Reid Memorial Lecture, the highlight of Jimmy Reid Foundation public calendar. As you know, the late Jimmy Reid was a man of great principle, integrity, charisma and passion. A towering, straight-talking Governite who uttered the immortal lines, "There will be no hooliganism, there will be no vandalism, there will be no bevving, because the world is watching us." As he successfully led an unheard of work-in at the closure-threatened Upper Clyde shipyards, introducing the nation, and indeed the world, to a proud and skilled workforce led by a shop steward who believed in justice and fairness, and who talked the language of the common man. Jimmy understood that the finest weapon an individual possesses is their dignity and decency, the hallmark of great men and women, and I would say as well, the hallmark of Scottish people. Someone else springs to mind as well, and that is an adopted Glaswegian and freeman of the city, the late, great Nelson Mandela, who was very much in the same vein. Another person I would like to mention as well is our First World War firebrand, rent striker and fellow Governite, the inspirational Mary Barber. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy Reid's convictions served him well throughout his life. They were his moral compass. His legacy, the Jimmy Reid Foundation, is an independent think tank committed to progressive politics in Scotland, politics based on equality and social justice. Jimmy Reid's portrait hangs very suitable at the People's Palace, the perfect place, I'm sure you all agree, for someone who always did put the needs and the wishes of the ordinary man and woman first. He was certainly one who contributed to make Glasgow into what we are today and who we are. Glasgow's greatest asset is our citizens, the people who make Glasgow. And before I extend my welcome to the speaker of this year's lecture, I would say the theme is very interesting for me personally. Of course, you know the theme is a future after Brexit, trade unions and the Scandinavian model of social democracy. Some of you will know that I am not Scottish by birth. Some of you will know that I am actually Swedish by birth and spent a large part of my life in Scandinavian, in Stockholm. And it's very personal to me, this as well. Both my grandfathers were shop stewards, various places, different places, as well as very engaged in the Social Democrats Party, the Swedish comparatively Labour Party. So I was brought up very much in the vein of social democracy through the 60s and 70s as a child, and see the introduction of huge reforms that was very much in the vein of what Jimmy Reid was talking about, equality and justice. And as well, one I think of the main developments then was the introduction of universal childcare, which liberated very many women and provided obviously a great extended workforce to the society. So today's lecture I'm very much looking forward to, and of course I am so delighted that in this year, the 150th anniversary of the Trades Union Congress, it is a privilege to welcome here to the City Chambers this year's guest speaker, the General Secretary of the TUC, Francis O'Grady. So without much further ado, I will leave over to the next person who's going to say a few words, and thank you all for coming and taking part in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Provost. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now pass you over to Lynn Henderson, the President of the STUC and Vice Convener of the Reid Foundation.
I've got a sore throat. Lord Provost, Reid family, brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, I would like to welcome you to the 6th annual lecture organised in honour of Jimmy Reid and to remember his legacy. I'm Lynn Henderson, the President of the Scottish Trade Union Congress and a National Officer for the Public and Commercial Services Union, and I'll be chairing tonight's lecture and the Q&A. Our annual lecture is intended to carry on the spirit of radical political discourse and debate in the spirit that Jimmy enjoyed throughout his life. Jimmy was one of this small nation's greatest orators. His rectorial address at the University of Glasgow still makes my hair stand on end today. But Jimmy was more than just a good speaker, or a great writer, or a cool guy with stage presence. Jimmy was a son of Govan in this city, and he grew up in the Labour and trade union movement. He was a union man, an activist, a rabble-rouser, and a proven leader. Not a proven leader, a proven leader. As a wee girl, whenever I saw Jimmy on the telly, I thought he was my uncle, because I had an Uncle Jimmy who worked in the docks in Leith, who was also a handsome, dark-haired chap. We remain proud today of the international recognition afforded to our movement by the successful Upper Clyde shipyards working in June 1971 to October 1972. The political journey that Jimmy chose is not unusual for many Scots. First a communist, then a Labour member, and latterly a member of the SNP. His principles throughout remain solid. Jimmy believed in the collective power of working class people in their workplaces and their communities. His desire for socialism and for an independent Scotland was not a contradiction, and one that lives on in the hearts of many of our peoples. How we wish Jimmy was here today to witness the left-led Corbyn Labour leadership and to participate in the ongoing debates on Scottish Home Rule, independence, and of course the current Tory omnishambles of Brexit. In the 5 annual lectures we've come before, we've heard First Ministers and Union General Secretaries, and this is the first time we've had the honour of welcoming the most senior trade unionist in Britain to our lectern. 2018 marks the 150th anniversary of the TUC, as the Lord Provost said, and there's been year-long celebrations and events marking this achievement. And it's a very great honour for the Reid Foundation to welcome Francis to our lecture tonight in this very special year for the British Trade Union Congress. Most people here know that the Scottish TUC is a completely independent and autonomous trade union centre for Scotland. It's not a Scottish regional organisation, the TUC, and STUC was established in 1897 as a result largely of a political dispute over political representation within the Labour movement. But from the outset, the STUC was not in competition with the TUC, and still today we exist side by side fighting for workers. Earlier this month, the TUC Congress reconvened in Manchester, where it was born, at the Manchester Mechanics Institute in 1868. At that time, women made up around 10% of union membership. Francis' address to Congress earlier this month highlighted that last century was one in which we won the weekend for workers, and that now, in this century, and she didn't mean the end, it's time that we won a 4-day week. Francis is the first woman General Secretary of the TUC. As I observed in my article in the recent Scottish Left Review, oftentimes women in senior positions in our movement and in society more generally are judged harsher than their male counterparts. because women are judged by their gender rather than their acts. Frances has been a TUC General Secretary for just 7 of those 150 years. So guys, you've got a lot to answer for, and we've got a lot to gain. So can I ask you to give a warm welcome to our speaker for the 2018 Annual Jimmy Reid Lecture, Frances O'Grady.
Did anybody else used to watch Dave Allen? Anyway, LYNN, Lord Provost, friends, comrades. The phrase working class hero has become something of a cliche, used and sometimes abused. But tonight we remember someone worthy of that title. Jimmy Reid was certainly working class. He was born in Glasgow and left school at 14. His father was in and out of work. One of 7 children, 3 of his siblings died in infancy. And as was the way for many of his generation, he was self-educated. Once, when a somewhat pompous academic asked him which university he'd studied at, quick as a flash, Jimmy replied, Govan Library. And for millions of people, Jimmy was a hero, not least the shipyard workers whose livelihoods and communities he did so much to save. An engineer by trade, Jimmy was a union organiser by vocation, and his cause was human dignity. Standing up for people facing the everyday humiliations and petty tyrannies born of an economy rigged in favour of the few. He was from the school of trades unionism that spoke the language of morality, and he had faith in working people's ability to shape our own future. You could say that Jimmy was the trade union movement's Steve Biko, raising consciousness and class pride, building self-belief. And for Jimmy, class struggle wasn't just a matter for theoretical debate. It was about how we live our lives, fighting for our rights, yes, but also encouraging each other, looking after each other, friendship, love, and compassion. As a French socialist once said, the brain works on both sides of the body, but the heart beats only on the left. The work-in was a case in point. It was a magnificent rebuke to the boss's age-old tactic of a lockout and an industrial tactic of immense intelligence and imagination, for which, of course, Jimmy Airlie and others deserve great credit too. But it was also an appeal to fellow human feeling, solidarity, and the world was watching. During the dispute, the situation became so serious that Ted Heath's press secretary urged him to abandon his yacht race and return to number 10, as he said, at great inconvenience. In fact, he urged the Prime Minister to do so, and I quote, at great demonstrable inconvenience, an early example of political spin. But the public was unimpressed by the grandiose sailor's sacrifice, and on the contrary, the work-ins inspired support for the shipyard workers far and wide and from all walks of life. At one point, famously, a cheque for £5,000 arrived, signed simply Lennon. One shop steward remarked, "It cannot be Lennon, he's dead." It was, of course, from John Lennon. In the trade union movement, Jimmy's life and times still inspire us. And that's why it's such a huge honour to be here in George Square in the presence of Jimmy's family to deliver this lecture. And doubly so in a year when the TUC celebrates our 150th birthday. So I'd like to thank the Jimmy Reid Foundation for inviting me, the City Council for kindly hosting this event, and to all of you for coming along tonight. And as the Lord Provost said, I'm hoping that in Jimmy's words, there'll be no hooliganism or vandalism, but perhaps later on we'll enjoy some bevying. So tonight I want to talk about how we can draw on Jimmy's spirit and insights to win justice for working people. But I should warn you, this won't be an exercise in nostalgia. I believe that would be a disservice to the memory of a man who was so far-sighted and to the new generation of workers who need unions to solve the problems of today, not yesterday, including, I would say, those brave strikers at McDonald's and TGI Fridays. You can clap them if you like. Those leading the brilliant Better Than Zero campaign here in Scotland, and the hundreds of low-paid workers helping the TUC to test out new digital models of organising right across the UK. Because, of course, capitalism has changed from the model of 40 years ago, when huge swathes of the workforce were employed in heavy industries. And that means we must change too. Just a decade ago, the Lehman Brothers crash exposed the neglect of the real economy and the consequences of the financialisation of capital. But now it's changed again. Today, corporate wealth lists are dominated by tech giants like Apple and Amazon, multinational companies that respect no borders and salute no flags. Accelerating the speed of globalization, combining corporate, social and digital power on an unprecedented scale, and heralding a period of major disruption industrially, politically and at work. Now, Jimmy famously spoke of how we are not rats. Well, perhaps today we have to assert that we are not robots. Except for that, in my experience as a trade unionist, robots get much better care and maintenance than many workers do. So let's say that we refuse to be slaves to an app, like Uber drivers and Deliveroo riders, or Amazon's mechanical Turks. Not just alienated, but atomized, the ultimate flexible workforce, working tiny bits of pay, tiny bits of time for tiny bits of pay. And our challenge, brothers and sisters, is to organise them. So I want to focus on prospects for the new working class and the future of work. But first, I do need to say something about that B word, Brexit. Because just over 180 days from now, Britain is due to leave the EU, and it's the greatest peacetime challenge that we've ever faced. And frankly, it is one almighty mess. While the TUC campaigned hard for a Remain vote, we respected the referendum result to leave the EU. As always, our task is to unite workers, and that's true whichever way they voted in that referendum. So the TUC has argued for a Brexit deal that puts working people first, that secures the trade, investment and growth on which livelihoods depend, that guarantees a level playing field on rights at work with our friends in Europe, and one that safeguards peace and the Good Friday Agreement, something that trade unionists on both sides of the water worked hard to support. The TUC has looked at all the options, and we believe that workers' best interests would be served by what some call Norway plus the customs union. Because if we trade from outside the single market, expensive red tape and tariffs will hike prices, hit pay, and hurt jobs. Because trading inside would avoid the current contortions over the border of Ireland, and because the safety net of rights that unions fought so hard for from consultation rights on redundancy to paid holidays can't be unpicked by any Tory government as long as we have to stick by single market rules. Now, if anybody's got a better idea, then we're open to it. But so far, we haven't heard any. And we reject the Hobson's choice of a bad deal or no deal. If Mrs May's proposals would hit working people hard, her hardliners' no-deal nonsense could break us. But even if Brussels agreed Mrs May's withdrawal proposals, it's very unclear whether Westminster will. As we all know, the governing party in Westminster is at war with itself. Many Conservatives seem more interested in who's going to get their own party's top job than saving anybody else's. And by the way, I think it seems a little unfair for Mrs May to accuse Brussels of showing her no respect when her own colleagues have made no secret of the fact that they're busy collecting signatures to dump her. Meanwhile, many people are watching this spectacle with dismay. They're worried about their own livelihoods, and in particular, they're worried about the job prospects for their kids. And it's little comfort that perhaps the Prime Minister now finally understands what it's like to be on a 0 hours contract. The hard Brexiteers on the backbenches are ready to pounce, the likes of Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg. I confess that in the past I've likened them to Lord Snooty and his pals from the comic The Beano, but the truth is they're not just harmless English eccentrics. What the hard Brexiteers really want is low tax, low regulation, free for all, carving up our NHS and weakening workers' rights. A dose of what they like to call capitalist creative destruction, shock and awe, all under the guise of shaking up the establishment, when in fact they are the establishment and they're the top brass of the establishment. So these are dangerous times, and the rise of right-wing nationalism should worry all Democrats. Inspired by Trump in the West and Putin in the East, across Europe and in Britain, the new far right is gaining traction. President Trump's former advisor, Steve Bannon, has set up office in Brussels, and the far right's campaign strategies are getting more sophisticated. Their anti-immigration, anti-Muslim message mobilises thousands on the streets in towns across England, but millions more online. They've got big money and they're globally networked, grooming right-wing politicians in mainstream political parties, targeting blue-collar workers who are rightly angry about an economic system that is failing them, and using Brexit as an opportunity to destabilise a model that, while, and believe you me, we understand is far from perfect, but nevertheless has kept the peace in Europe for nearly 70 years. So as we count down to March next year, the stakes couldn't be higher, not least here in Scotland, where nearly 2/3 of voters voted to remain, and where communities that are already struggling will pay the highest price. Like the TUC, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has rightly called for an extension to Article 50 to give us a chance to negotiate a deal on new terms. A deal that we want to see is one that protects jobs, rights and peace in Ireland. But the truth is, most people don't trust the Westminster government to get that deal, and we're running out of road. So I've been taking the same message to all politicians, that this is not the time to keep your head down. We need to hear more voices speaking up for working people wherever they live. And I hope that Nicola Sturgeon will join me in putting the Prime Minister on notice and warn Mrs May that if we don't get a deal on the terms that working people need, we will mobilise for a popular vote on the final deal. People deserve the final say. After all, trade unionists are required to put the outcome of a negotiation to the ballot of our members. Why shouldn't the Conservative government have to put the terms of their deal to the vote too? But whatever happens with Brexit, we are going to have to get to terms as a trade union movement with the way that the world of work is changing. A capitalism that's more global, more mobile, more ruthless than ever before, and more digital too, reshaping power, politics and work in profound ways. Now, as we know, in the late 20th century, finance capital called the shots. Markets were deregulated, banks began to gamble, private equity, hedge funds, shadow banking all became more powerful. Trillions of pounds could be moved at the flick of a switch, and financial investments began to crowd out productive investment with exotic new derivative products invented. And of course, workers' bargaining power was attacked. Cheap debt took the place of wages as a driver for growth, and the inevitable result was the meltdown we saw in 2008. But today's capitalism changing again. The new masters of the universe make their money from information, data, the new oil. And by the way, these companies are taking much of that data from us for free. The tech giant's ambition is not just to drive down wages and drive up profits, but to redefine work itself. As adept at sidestepping labour standards as they are at dodging tax, they are uprooting the lives of millions of workers, reducing employment to a digital platform, replacing jobs with gigs, and in the process, stripping out even the most basic rights. So Uber, we proved it, GMB proved it, had to go to court to prove it, but Uber is a transport firm, but it owns no vehicles and employs no drivers. Amazon, they like to call their warehouses fulfillment centres, but workers are on their feet for 12-hour shifts, tagged like cattle, timed and tracked, too afraid to take sick leave or even a toilet break. And Deliveroo has ordained that its digital army of riders are self-employed. So there's no right to a minimum wage, no right to holiday pay, and no right to be accompanied by a union rep. Workers without a workplace, hired and fired by smartphone, no boss to negotiate with, at the app's beck and call, relying on food banks to feed their children, and loan sharks to get through the week. Britain today. But we ain't seen nothing yet. Artificial intelligence, automation, and algorithms will transform work. Now, the Bank of England tells us that 15 million jobs are vulnerable, not just the likes of cooking and cleaning and driving, but white-collar and professional jobs too. And of course, the Westminster government's message on all of this is be grateful for a job, any job. But we're arguing it doesn't have to be this way. We can choose to do things differently and forge a fair transition from the old world to the new. Now, Jimmy Reid famously challenged the rights of any man or any group of men in business or in government to tell a fellow human being that he or she is expendable. And I believe that must be our guiding principle now. Now, of course, there are threats ahead. Some jobs will go, some will be created, but many, many more will change. The idea that steel workers can move seamlessly into becoming software engineers won't wash for most people. But as a society, we could set ourselves a positive goal. We could choose to replace mind-numbing, monotonous, soul-destroying work with better paid, more skilled, more satisfying jobs. And there is plenty of good work that needs to be done, involving skills that can't be replaced by tech, with creativity, human judgment, the care sector. These are just a few examples. Now, that's why the TUC has argued for a commission on the future of work, bringing governments, employers, unions to the table to plan a fair transition. And I believe, by the way, that Scotland could lead the way on that. Looking at how to invest in and deploy the new technologies so we upgrade firms and upgrade skills. And when it comes to the predicted multi-billion pound productivity gains, the promised gains are big. We could figure out how workers and our public services get fair shares. Now, I contend that the promised gains from technological changes should also mean more time for ourselves and our families. Now, that's something that feels all the more important in a week when we've learned that nearly a quarter of young girls are harming themselves. That, to me, is shocking. And that every year, the same proportion of adults suffer from a mental health problem. Now, no doubt the causes are complex, but the 21st century sickness of anxiety, stress, low self-esteem is spreading, and growing job intensity, impossible workloads, and the lack of a sense of any voice or control over our working lives, these are all taking their toll. Families need more time together, but the cost of childcare is rising 3 times faster than wages, so many parents only manage by working back-to-back shifts. When they get home, they're exhausted. At our 150th Congress, I said that if the big victory of the last century had been a 2-day weekend, then surely this century we should lift our sights, lift our ambitions, and look to win a 4-day week. As Jimmy Reid argued, and I want to quote him, if automation and technology is accompanied, as it must be, with full employment, then the leisure time available to man will also be enormously increased. If that is so, then our whole concept of education must change. The whole object must be to equip and educate people for life, not solely for work or a profession. So how this tech revolution pans out in the future is all about the choices that we make now. We've got nothing to fear from that revolution if it's matched with a revolution in skills, in workplace rights, and social protections. If we revitalise and spread collective bargaining so that the gains aren't just all grabbed by the greedy at the top. If we make sure that tech-poor communities and towns are included. If we agree that we will prioritise the common good. Instead of enslavement, tech could be a force for liberation, for better work and richer lives. And this takes me to our final priority, which is that alternative vision for the future. So the digital capitalists, they've got theirs. The right-wing populists, they've got theirs. I believe it's about time we spoke up for ours. Now, I imagine the organisers are waiting for when I was going to get to this point, because when I was invited to deliver this lecture, I was asked to talk about unions and Scandinavian social democracy. And certainly at a time when the hard Brexiteers want to drive us towards aping Trump's America, there's a strong case instead for looking across the North Sea. If the only choice we faced was between Trump-style populism or Nordic social democracy, then frankly, there would be no contest. And it's easy to see the attractions of that Scandinavian social democracy. In its different manifestations, it's been more resilient and more productive and more successful than many other models. Sweden's welfare state shows that with fair taxation, you can deliver world-class childcare and social care. Denmark guarantees a high minimum wage and more generous unemployment benefits, providing security for the low-paid and those without work. And Norway's sovereign wealth fund, built up from North Sea reserves, has become the world's richest pension fund. Contrast that with how Margaret Thatcher squandered the North Sea windfall, paying for mass unemployment and tax cuts for the rich. So it's not surprising that the Nordics are still near the top of the world rankings for happiness, openness, education, gender equality. I remember many years ago when I was pregnant, campaigning for the UK, this was many years ago, campaigning for the UK to sign up to the European Directive on better paid maternity leave, because it was rubbish in Britain, really rubbish. And I wore a badge. Well, we had several badges, like I'd rather have a baby in Finland or I'd rather have a baby in Norway, basically anywhere but the UK. And of course, if you looked at Scandinavia, you know, this was back then when we got, was it 6 weeks at 90% anyway, of full pay, and that was, you know, basically it. Over there, it was like nearly a year's well-paid maternity leave. But more than that, whole cities and towns were designed and built around the needs of children. And it was taken for granted that a good society needs active citizens. And the great majority of working people were protected by collective bargaining. So, yes, I agree, post-Brexit Britain could do a lot worse than go Scandinavian. But we also have to recognise that the world has changed, and social democracy, even Scandinavian style, is under pressure. Since the crash, many social democratic parties have tanked at the ballot box. In France, attracting just 6% of voters in last year's presidential elections. In Germany, the latest poll I looked at showed the SPD is only 1 point ahead of the neo-fascist, in my book, AFD. And in Denmark, it pains me to say this, that on immigration, the social democratic rhetoric seems to be trying to outflank that of the right, blaming the victims of poverty, describing working-class neighbourhoods as ghettos, and scapegoating, in my book, scapegoating migrants for society's ills. But there is an alternative, and I think we can look close to home. For all its difficulties, Labour has reinvented itself by moving decisively to the left. Yes, it's true, Labour didn't win the last general election. And yes, it has its work cut out to inspire the same confidence and hope in blue-collar heartlands that it has inspired amongst the young. But having started the 2017 campaign with 27% of public support, by election day, 4 in 10 people cast their vote for a party with a red-blooded programme for change. Can Labour get over the 45% line by appealing to blue-collar aspirations as well as middle-class insecurity? It won't be easy, but it can be done. Now, Jimmy Reid, of course, was a supporter of Scottish independence, and it's not my intention to use this platform to wade into that debate, nor is it my place. Scotland's future is a matter for self-determination, a matter for the Scottish people. Likewise, the question about whether the SNP is genuinely social democratic, and the broader issue of whether, whatever its political hue, a coalition based on nationalism can hold. But I am a trade unionist, and I still hold with Mick McGahi's view that workers here in Scotland will always have more in common with workers in London, Durham or Sheffield than they will ever have with Scottish barons or traitor landlords. Capitalism knows no borders, neither should we. We need a new socialist politics, strong enough to reverse that obscene shift of wealth and power into ever fewer hands. After all, workers create the wealth, and we deserve a fair share of it. Economic justice is the only way to build a strong society, more equal, more welcoming, more humane. Investing in schools and hospitals, building council homes, strengthening pride in our communities, taking strategically important industries like our railways and our post back where they belong into public ownership, and making the rich and big corporations pay their fair share of tax. And I might add, certainly not giving the likes of Amazon tax breaks when they rip off their workers and refuse to recognise a trade union. As Jimmy Reid rightly identified, alienation, which he called the frustration of ordinary people excluded from the process of decision-making, that remains one of our biggest challenges. As he saw it, the untapped resources of the North Sea were nothing compared to the untapped resources of people. For Jimmy, political democracy had to be matched with industrial democracy. He argued that government by the people, for the people, becomes meaningless unless it includes major economic decision-making by the people, for the people. And he was right. In my view, democracy should not stop at the workplace door. Every worker should have the right to a collective voice through a union. Employers should have an obligation to collectively bargain with us. And our voice should be heard at every level, up to and including the boardroom. For inspiration, we should be guided by what drove Jimmy Reid throughout his life: human dignity. The dignity of doing a good job, fairly rewarded, of being respected at work and in society, of having somewhere decent to live, and of knowing that from cradle to grave, good public services will be there when you need them. That's the dignity that inspired Jimmy Reid, that inspires me, and that continues to inspire millions of trade unionists today. Now, Jimmy's political affiliations may have changed from Communist Party to Labour to the SNP, but his values remained true. As the former MP Brian Wilson wrote, Few individuals in the political or trade union arena over the past century have raised so many spirits, challenged so many assumptions, or offered more vivid glimpses of a different social order. So I believe the best way we can honour Jimmy's memory is to fight for the future. As the Upper Clyde shipbuilders working showed, we can achieve great things together, and it's no coincidence that UCS came to stand for unity creates strength. And whether it's the rise of the right or the rise of the robots, we need that same sense of solidarity now. A new class politics, a new shared identity, and for men and women, young and old, black and white, a stronger trade union movement and a new shared cause. For me, 21st century socialism. Thank you very much.